"You don't have to love me," she said. "The rancher married her anyway, and then couldn't remember how not to." I have been asked over the years how a man of my particular temperament ends up married twice to women he chose himself, and happy about it both times. The first time was obvious enough. I was 26, and Marta was 23, and we were both young enough to think happiness was something you arrived at rather than something you built. The second time is harder to explain, because it started as a business arrangement, and I was 46 years old and had no intention of being anything but practical about it. Josephine Mercer showed up at my door on the 14th of April, 1883, which I remember because the mud was still running from the spring thaw, and she had come up my road in a wagon that had no business making it, and arrived at my porch with her hem dark to the knee and her expression one of complete composure, as if she had planned the mud and was satisfied with how it had gone. She was 34 years old, medium height, with brown hair pinned back with the no-nonsense efficiency of a woman who does not spend time on her appearance that could be spent on something useful. She had steady gray eyes, and a way of looking at you that suggested she had already thought through what you were going to say and had her answer ready. She was carrying a leather satchel and a rolled document that turned out to be her late brother's land claim deed. She said, "Mr. Prest, my name is Josephine Mercer. I have a proposal of a practical nature, and if you'll give me 20 minutes I'll explain it fully. I've brought documentation." I said, "Come in then." She sat at my kitchen table and laid the deed out flat and explained. Her brother Daniel had come west 3 years prior and claimed a parcel of land, 160 acres of decent river-bottom ground 2 miles east of my property line. Daniel had died the previous November of a fever, and the claim had passed to Joe as his only heir. She had come from Missouri in March to take possession, filed the necessary papers, and found that the Alcott operation, a cattle outfit 3 miles north of my property, was contesting the claim on the grounds that a single woman living alone was not in full compliance with the residency requirements of the Homestead Act, and had hired a lawyer to make that argument in court. Joe said the lawyer was wrong on the law, which she had read carefully, but that courts in new territories sometimes found reasons to agree with lawyers representing large cattle operations. She said the simplest solution, the one that removed the lawyer's argument entirely, was for her to be married to a man of standing in the county before the hearing, which was set for the first week of June. She had identified 3 men in the county who might be willing to enter such an arrangement. I was her first call. She slid a second document across the table. It was a contract she had written herself, in a clear and precise hand, laying out the terms. 1 year, separate rooms. She would manage the Mercer parcel. She had already hired 2 hands and help with the ranch house in exchange for use of the outbuildings and the ranches standing in the county. At the end of 1 year, they would dissolve the arrangement quietly and legally, and she would return to Missouri or stay on the Mercer parcel as she chose. She said, "I want to be direct with you. You don't have to love me. This is a practical matter. I need your name on a document and someone who will stand up in court and say I'm his wife. I am asking you to do a decent thing for a woman who has been treated unfairly, in exchange for compensation I've outlined in the contract. If you find the terms unacceptable, I have 2 other names." I read the contract. It was better drafted than anything the county clerk had produced in a year. I read it twice. Then I said, "Why me first?" She said, "You have a good reputation with the county judge. You are a widower without complications, and your house is closest to my parcel, which makes the arrangement logistically sensible." "Not because you find me charming," I said. She looked at me with those gray eyes. "I find you suitable," she said. "That is the relevant quality." I signed the contract. I have thought about that moment many times since. What I tell people when they ask is that I signed because the Alcott operation was a nuisance to every small landholder in the county, and I was glad of any opportunity to make their lawyers' mourning difficult. That is true, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that no one had spoken to me that directly in 7 years, and something in me that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting heard a plain voice say a plain thing, and answered. We were married by the circuit minister on the 21st of April. It took 12 minutes and involved a handshake at the end rather than a kiss, which suited us both. Jo moved her things into the east room that afternoon. She had 2 trunks, a crate of books, and a set of curtains she put up immediately, which were the first curtains in the ranch house since Marta died. I did not say anything about the curtains. They were yellow, and the east room had always been dark. The first week was the kind of careful that 2 people are when they are sharing a house and have made a practical arrangement and are both determined not to make it awkward. We said good morning. We ate supper together because Jo cooked and there was no sensible reason to eat separately. She cooked the way she did most things, efficiently, without fuss, and better than I expected. She did not ask me about Marta, and I did not ask her about Missouri, and we talked about the weather and the land case and the spring condition of the Alcott fence line, which was my business and had become, now, marginally hers. The thing about Jo was that she was quiet the right amount. Some people fill silence because they're uncomfortable with it. She left it alone when it didn't need filling and used it when it did, and I had been a man who lived in silence for 7 years and found that I could not be irritated by her because she never put a word where one wasn't needed. On the 8th day she came in from the Mercer parcel in the late afternoon covered in red clay dust and sat down at the kitchen table and said, "My east fence line has a problem. I don't have enough wire. I have the post set, but I ran short by about 80 yards. I've got wire in the barn," I said. "How much do you need?" 80 yards, she said. "I heard you the first time," I said. "I'm trying to decide if I want to be charitable or drive a hard bargain." She looked at me. Then the corner of her mouth turned up, just barely, just the corner, the most economical expression of humor I had ever seen. "What's your price?" she said. "I'll think of something," I said. She said, "You can have 2 jars of my mother's blackberry preserves and the use of my east meadow for summer grazing." "Done," I said. That was the first time she almost smiled. I drove the wire out to the Mercer parcel the next morning and helped her string it because the posts were set awkward on the creek bank, and it was a 2-person job, and we worked in the kind of comfortable silence that is not really silence at all but a form of conversation. It was sometime in May that the boy appeared. His name was Pete Aldrin. He was 11 years old with a thatch of red hair and a watchful quality that came from living careful. His mother had died 2 winters back. His father drove freight between Garnet Crossing and the mining camps to the north, and was gone more than he was home. Pete was not delinquent, exactly. He was unsupervised, which in an 11-year-old boy produces similar results. He turned up in my yard one morning because he had heard I had a litter of pups from my cattle dog, and he wanted to see them. I showed him the pups. He came back the next day to see them again. By the end of the week, he was coming every morning and doing small jobs around the barn without being asked, feeding the pups, sweeping the stall, with the instinct of a boy who has learned that making himself useful is how you get to stay. Jo met him on the Friday of his 2nd week. She had come over from the Mercer parcel for supper and found him in the barn reorganizing my tack with opinions about how it should be hung. She stood in the barn door and looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Are you being paid for this?" He said, "No, ma'am." She said, "You should be. Mr. Prest, this boy is doing work and not being compensated. That's not businesslike." I said, "He's doing it voluntarily." She said, "Voluntarily or not, if the work has value it should be paid. Pete, what would you consider fair?" Pete thought about this with great seriousness. He said, "A meal." Jo said, "Done." And that was how Pete started eating supper with us 3 nights a week. I watched this happen and did not comment on it, because there was nothing to comment on. It was a practical arrangement, like everything Jo did. But I noticed that when Pete was at the table, the kitchen had a particular quality that was different from when it was just the two of us, fuller somehow. And I noticed that Jo brought it about without seeming to try. She asked Pete questions and listened to the answers. She lent him books from her crates and then talked with him about what he'd read in the same direct way she talked to adults. She did not speak down to him, and in return, he gave her the complete and uncritical loyalty that a boy that age gives to the first adult who treats him as worth talking to. The land hearing was on the 3rd of June. Jo and I rode to the county seat together in the buckboard. The Alcott lawyer was a thin man from Cheyenne named Falwell who had the look of someone accustomed to winning on technicalities. He presented his argument, which was, as Jo had predicted, the residency, the lone woman, the insufficiency of her claim. The judge asked me 3 questions. He asked how long I had been a resident of the county, which was 16 years. He asked whether my wife was residing on adjacent property that we were operating jointly, which was accurate as far as it went. He asked whether I had any objection to the Mercer claim being confirmed in full. I said I had no objection whatsoever, and that the Alcott operations history of contesting smaller landholders' claims was, in my view, a matter the court might find worth noting. The Alcott lawyer objected. The judge noted it and ruled in Jo's favor. We drove home in the buckboard with the confirmed deed in Jo's satchel and the late afternoon light on the range, and neither of us said much for the first few miles. Then Jo said, "You didn't have to mention the Alcott history." "I know," I said. "That was more than the contract required." "Yes," I said. She looked out at the range. "Thank you," she said. She said it the way she said everything, plain, without decoration, meaning every word. "You're welcome," I said, and then we didn't talk for another 2 miles, but it was the comfortable kind. Something shifted after the hearing. It was hard to put a name to it because it shifted gradually, and neither of us acknowledged it, but the quality of the silences changed, and the suppers changed. And the way she looked at me sometimes was different from the way she had looked at me when she sat down at my kitchen table with a contract and 2 other names in her pocket. She was reading one of her books on the porch one evening in July, and I came and sat in the other chair. There were 2 chairs on that porch, and I had sat in the right-hand one for 7 years without occupying the left, and we sat there without talking until the light went. And it was the most natural thing that had happened to me in longer than I could count. I said, "What are you reading?" She held up the book. It was a history of the Roman Empire. I said, "Any practical application for Montana cattle country?" She said, "Infrastructure. The Romans were excellent at it. We should consider a proper irrigation ditch on the east parcel." I said, "I know someone who digs irrigation ditches." She said, "I know. I've already spoken to him. He starts in August." I looked at her. She looked back at me with those gray eyes, with the corner of her mouth turned up just the way it did when she thought something was funny. "You could have mentioned that," I said. "I'm mentioning it now," she said. I went inside and went to bed, and lay there for a while thinking about a woman who had already solved the problem before she told me there was one, and found that I was not irritated by this at all. Pete's father came home in late July. Gus Aldrin was a big, decent enough man who drank too much when he was between freighting runs and was not, in Jo's stated opinion, giving his son the supervision a boy needed. She said this to me, not to Gus, because it was a private opinion, and she was not a woman who offered private opinions to people who hadn't asked. But she had started leaving books on the porch for Pete to take home, and she had quietly arranged with the schoolteacher in Garnet Crossing, a young woman named Miss Bain, to hold Pete's place in the fall term regardless of whether his fees were current. I said, "You can't solve every problem." She said, "I'm not trying to solve every problem. I'm trying to solve the ones in front of me." I said, "And Pete is in front of you." She said, "Pete is eating supper at my table 3 nights a week and has read 4 of my books. That puts him in front of me, yes." I didn't argue with this. She was right, and I had long since stopped arguing with her when she was right, which saved me considerable time. What I noticed was that she said, "My table. My table, not your table, not the table." She had been saying things like that for a month without, I thought, being aware of it. She said "our fence line" when she meant the property border between the two parcels. She said "our arrangement" when she meant the contract, but the word "our" had started to carry a different weight than it had in April. I did not say anything about this. I was a man of 50 who had been alone for 7 years and had forgotten, mostly, how to say the things that mattered without making them smaller by saying them wrong. I sat with it and waited, which was what I knew how to do. August came in hot and dry. The irrigation ditch went in on schedule, and the east parcel of the Mercer claim put up its first hay crop. Joe supervised the cutting with the 2 hands she'd hired, good men, both of them, who had taken her measure in the first week, and decided she was worth working for. And I helped with the stacking because I had the equipment and my own cutting was done. We worked 3 days on it together, and on the 3rd evening we sat on the tailgate of the wagon and ate the supper she'd packed and watched the light go off the cut field. She said, "It's a good piece of land." "It is," I said. "Daniel had a good eye for it." She was quiet a moment. "He would have liked it here," she said. "He talked about coming west for years before he finally did. He was cautious. He waited until he was sure." It was the first time she had talked about Daniel since the day she laid the deed on my table. I didn't rush it. "What was he like?" I said. She told me about Daniel, a careful, quiet man who read too much and worried too much and had finally, at 31, done the thing he had been meaning to do, and had 3 years of it before the fever took him. She told it plainly, the way she told everything, but there was something underneath the plainness that I recognized. The particular quality of grief that has settled, not gone, just settled, into the substructure of things. When she was done, I said, "I had a wife named Marta. She died of a fever too, 7 years ago." "I know," she said. "People in Garnet Crossing mention it." "What do they say?" "That you haven't been the same since, that you're difficult." She paused. "I don't find you difficult." "You find me suitable," I said. "I did," she said, "in April." I looked at her. She was looking at the cut field, her hands around her coffee cup, her face in the last of the evening light. "And now," I said. She said, "Now I find you something else. I haven't decided on the word for it." She climbed off the tailgate and went to check on the horses, and I sat there on the wagon in the darkening, and decided I was going to have to do something, sooner or later, about a woman who always had her answer ready except when it mattered most. September brought the first cold and the beginning of the school term. Pete started in Miss Bain's class, his fees current. I had paid them myself quietly, because Joe had already arranged the books and I didn't want her paying for everything. And he came to supper on his usual nights and reported on his progress with the seriousness of a boy who has decided that learning is something worth being serious about. One evening in late September, Pete asked me, with the directness of the young, whether Mrs. Prest was going to stay. I said, "What makes you ask?" He said, "Billy Cutler at school says you got married because of a land thing, and she's going to leave when it's done." I said, "Billy Cutler doesn't know everything." Pete said, "Is he wrong?" I said, "Go ask Mrs. Prest." He did. I heard him from the other room. He said, "Mrs. Prest, are you going to leave?" Joe said, "I haven't decided yet." Pete said, "What would make you decide to stay?" There was a pause. Then Joe said, "That's a very direct question." Pete said, "You like direct questions." Another pause. Joe said, "Yes, I do. The answer is that the right person would have to ask me." Pete came back to the parlor and looked at me with an expression that said he had done his part, and the rest was my problem. October moved through with the particular quality of Montana fall, cold and bright and short-dagged, and the year's end was 8 weeks out. I had not said anything. I had been thinking about how to say it and what to say, and whether she had meant what I thought she meant on the wagon tailgate in August. I am not a man who misreads things as a rule, but I had been wrong about important things before, and the cost of being wrong now felt large in a way it hadn't felt about anything in 7 years. What moved me to act in the end was not a revelation. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening in the third week of October. We had finished supper and Joe was at the table with her account books, and I was in the chair by the stove with a harness I was oiling, and Pete had gone home an hour earlier, and the house was quiet the way it was quiet in the evenings now, not empty quiet, the way it had been for 7 years, but full quiet, the way a house is when the right people are in it. I looked up from the harness, and she was bent over the account books with the lamp closed, and a strand of hair loose across her forehead and her lips moving slightly the way they did when she was doing arithmetic. And I thought, I have been sitting in this chair looking forward to this particular quality of quiet for going on 6 months, and I am 50 years old and I have been alone since I was 43, and this is what I have been waiting for without knowing I was waiting, and the contract expires in April. I put the harness down. I said, Joe. She looked up. I said, I want to say something, and I want to say it right, so I'd appreciate it if you didn't answer until I'm finished. She set her pen down. Her face was careful and still. I said, I know what the contract says. I helped write the terms. 1 year, separate rooms, dissolution in April. I understand that's what you came here to do, and I have no complaint about any of it. You've been square with me from the first day, and you've been more than I expected in most of the ways that count. I stopped. What I want to tell you is that somewhere between April and October, I stopped thinking about this as an arrangement. I don't know exactly when it happened. I know it had something to do with 80 yards of fence wire, and a boy named Pete, and a history of the Roman Empire. And I know that I have been sitting across from you at this table for 6 months, and have not once wished I was sitting alone. She hadn't moved. I'm not asking you to stay because you need to, I said. Your land case is settled. You don't need my name on anything. I'm asking you because I want to ask you and because I think I am reasonably confident, though I've been wrong before, that the question has a chance of being answered in a way I'd find satisfying. I looked at her straight. I'm asking you to stay, not under a contract, under whatever terms you'd prefer to call it. She was quiet for a moment. The lamp between us threw soft light on her face. Then she said, I've been wondering how long it was going to take you. I said, that long. She said, approximately. I'm a cautious man, I said. You are, she agreed. It's occasionally irritating. I said, and? She looked at me with those gray eyes, steady and clear. And yes, she said, on one condition. Name it, I said. Pete, she said. I want us to talk to Gus Aldrin about whether Pete might spend more time here. Not permanently, not if Gus doesn't want it, but more than 3 suppers a week. He needs more than we've been giving him. I said, I was going to ask you the same thing. The corner of her mouth turned up, not almost this time. Fully, for the first time I had seen, warm and real and entirely her. All right then, she said, and picked up her pen and went back to her account books, which was the most Joe Mercer thing she could possibly have done. And I picked up my harness and went back to oiling it. And we sat there in the full quiet of a Tuesday evening in October, and neither of us said anything else because nothing else needed saying. We went and talked to Gus Aldrin that weekend. He was a man who knew his limitations and loved his son in the simple, inadequate way of a man who doesn't know how to be enough. He agreed to Pete spending 2 nights a week at the ranch and more during the school holidays. He shook my hand and then Joe's, and something in his face when he shook hers told me he understood more of the situation than we'd explained and was grateful. Pete moved a few of his things into the small room off the kitchen that had been a cold room and became, with Joe's organizing and a second-hand iron bed she found at the Garnet crossing dry goods, something else. He set his books on the shelf she put up for him, and the first evening he slept there, he came out in the morning and ate breakfast with us, and reported that the room was cold, and asked whether the stovepipe could be extended. Joe said, "I'll look into it." It was extended within a week. We dissolved the original contract in November, not in April when it expired, but in November when we filed new papers at the county seat, different papers, under different terms. The judge who had ruled on the land case looked over his reading glasses at the two of us and at the paperwork and said, "Didn't you two just get married in April?" I said we did. He said, "And you want to file this now?" Joe said, "We want to file it correctly. The original arrangement was for a specific purpose. This one is for a different purpose." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "What purpose is that?" Joe said, "The usual one." He signed the papers. We drove home in the buckboard with the new papers in Joe's satchel and the November cold coming off the mountains, and she had her hands in her lap, and I had mine on the reins, and we were quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I want to write to my mother." I said, "All right." She said, "I want to tell her I'm staying." "Good," I said. She said, "She'll want to visit in the spring." I said, "She's welcome." Joe said, "She'll have opinions about the house." I said, "She can have opinions. The curtains in the east room are excellent and I won't hear otherwise." Joe looked at me. Then she laughed, a real laugh, quick and warm, the first real laugh I had heard from her, and it was the best sound I had heard in this life in 7 years and possibly longer. I kept my eyes on the road and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would improve on it. She wrote to her mother that evening. I sat in my chair by the stove and watched her write it, the lamp close, the strand of hair loose across her forehead, her lips moving slightly. Pete was asleep in the cold room that was not cold anymore. The November wind was at the corners of the house. The yellow curtains were in the east room, and the kitchen was warm, and everything that had been empty was full. I had signed a 1-year contract in April to do a decent thing for a woman who had spoken to me plainly, and what I had gotten for it was a year I would not have traded for any other, and a woman I could not remember how to live without, and a boy who asked direct questions, and a house that had the right quality of quiet in the evenings. That is the accurate account of how a man of my particular temperament ended up married twice and happy about it both times. The first time was young and obvious. The second time I had no intention of it and did it anyway, and then found I couldn't remember a single reason why I ever would have done otherwise. She is still reading the Roman Empire. She has moved on to the medieval period. She says there are practical applications for irrigation and crop rotation. I believe her, because she has been right about most things since the first Tuesday in April, and I have long since stopped being surprised by it.